Hello, I'm June Reith.
And I'm Kyle Thompson.
And you're listening to General Intellect Unit. And this time we are continuing our reading of Entangled Life by Merlin Sheldrake. We're back from our summer break. It's been refreshing and, well, I don't know, has it? I don't know. I've been slightly refreshed.
Slightly. I think slightly is the correct term. Yeah.
I feel like every time we sit down to talk, one or both of us is slightly more worn down than before.
Yeah, I think if you talk to me, if you talked to me 2 weeks ago, I definitely would have been there. It was good because I got some progress with big work projects, but that was exhausting. Nothing to do with GIU. Yeah.
Well, I mean, that's it, right? Like, the project is always good. It's all the other shit that's going on in life is the obstacle.
Yeah, that's right.
Yeah. But yeah, we're back with Merlin Sheldrake. We're going to do chapters 3, 4, and 5 this time. Then next time we'll finish it all up and we'll be on to the next thing. So yeah, chapter 3, The Intimacy of Strangers, is, I think, one of the most interesting chapters in the book. It's about lichen, a kind of symbiotic fungal thingamajig. But really it's kind of a chapter about the limits of life and the kind of limits of identity.
Yeah, this is a awesome chapter. It's so good. This is so good. It's kind of following up on some of the mind-bending stuff that we covered in the last episode. This is similarly mind-bending, this chapter. It's so interesting. Yeah.
So, I mean, it opens up with some talk of, like, how lichen have been taken to space as part of experiments and, like, exposed to radiation and all kinds of horrible conditions in space to test the limits of survivability and to... As the chapter will kind of elaborate, it's going to test the panspermia hypothesis that, like, life on Earth could have been transferred here from other planets via meteorites and so on. And, like, could, lichen-alike forms of life attach to meteorites and survive re-entry? Could they survive travel through space? That's kind of one of the setups here. And the other setup is the dual hypothesis, right? That, like, in 1869, the Swiss botanist Simon Schwendener came up with a dual hypothesis of lichens, proposing that they were actually it was a composite organism of two organisms, a fungus and an algae. And this was, predictably, this hypothesis was widely rejected and seemed to be ridiculous, and then was eventually accepted wholesale.
Yeah, because the prevailing opinion in biology at the time, and so still, like, at least in common sense, very much still the case now, is that species diverge and descend from their own lines. And the idea of convergence or interlinkage in evolution is something that is seen as sort of on an aesthetic level, like contrary to the principles of what we understand nature to be, right?
And I mean, like, I think in there you can see some of the, I guess the classic kind of Marxian thing of, like, in a highly capitalistic and, like, competition oriented kind of society, you just kind of presume that everything's about competition. And when you're presented with evidence of collaboration across species and across kinds of life, it's rejected immediately. It's like, that's ludicrous. Even when the dual hypothesis was starting to be accepted, it was still kind of understood in terms of parasitism, that, like, one of these is the master, the other's the slave. And it becomes apparent with closer study that no, it's a mutual benefit sort of thing. It's a pretty weird arrangement, but both organisms get something out of it, and the fusion of the two produces a kind of produces an organism that can do things that neither of the two can do on their own. Is it the case that the trick here is that the algae can photosynthesize and the fungus can break up rock and digest minerals, and that's the twin benefits they get?
Yeah, I believe that's correct. So it says Schwendener proposed that the lichen fungus, known today as the mycobiont, offered physical protection and acquired nutrients for itself and for the algal cells. The algal partner, today known as the photobiont, a role sometimes played by photosynthetic bacteria, harvested light and carbon dioxide to make sugars that provided energy. So yeah, it's the fungus can provide protection and in some ways collect nutrients, and the algae can get you do photosynthesis to harvest light and carbon dioxide, which makes sugars, which the fungus can use. Yeah.
And there's an important point here that once the dual hypothesis was accepted, it became a kind of new way of thinking about life and about like a kind of whole new principle.
Yeah, exactly. This is the thing that's very surprising to me, is that this was actually the origin for the very concept of symbiosis.
Yeah, it's nuts, right?
Like it's not just that they discovered or debated that lichen could be symbiotic. It's that there was no conception of symbiosis in biology prior to the study of lichen.
It opens up a whole new realm of possibilities for thinking about life and thinking about all these kind of collaborations between organisms.
Yeah, and I mean, it's not to say that no one had ever thought about animals cooperating or anything like that before. It's just that in biology proper, this was not something that was thought or conceptualized in such a way that you could categorize anything as symbiotic.
Yeah, absolutely. There's a section then on, I mean, as is true of this book in general, there's these lovely kind of sections detailing the author's escapades going around British Columbia, paddling up to islands caked in lichen. It's all wonderful.
Yeah, I was just looking at some photos of the BC coastline the other day, and was like, oh yeah, there's that lichen that they're talking about in the book.
He uses that experience to kind of get into what lichen do. They're often the first to show up on, say, new islands that are formed by volcanic activity that are completely fresh environments. They're the first to get there, and they can start to break down the rock and establish soil. So lichen digests the rock. Once the lichen dies, it turns into soil, more or less. So it'd be pretty fundamental to life on Earth, terrestrial life at least.
Yeah, no, absolutely. Incredibly fundamental to terrestrial life. And then, you know, in terms of aquatic or marine life, there's obviously a whole bunch of consequences of having soils being produced and running off and having, you know, vegetation, all that existing, and all of that kind of stuff on the land that ends up like bleeding into the aquatic ecosystems.
Yeah. This notion of islands is also then used to explore the panspermia hypothesis, or just to kind of start to explore the concept of island in general, like, you know, an apparently isolated little system. You know, is the Earth a living island? Is it a sealed system in that kind of sense, or is it something you can kind of go between? In the same sense that, like, these new land masses that are formed by volcanic activity are not sealed systems, that spores blow in on the wind and, life gets to them. Could it happen across space, you know?
Yeah, exactly. Is that possible? Is it possible that lichen came to Earth in, or the components of lichen, at least the fungus and the algae came to Earth, um, in the same way that they were so instrumental in facilitating the movement of life from the oceans to the to ground, to yeah, solid land. Um,
Yeah, it's a notion that's kind of developed throughout the chapter, but I guess it's probably worth just kind of getting a bit more into it. That like, it in the end, it turns out it's fairly plausible. One of the things is that like, large meteorites they generate a lot of friction in the atmosphere, and so tend to burn up. And so experiments where you strap some lichen to the outside of a re-entry vessel, once you look at it afterwards, there's nothing left. It's all burnt away. But a lot of like celestial material arrives on Earth as like dust, like microparticles. That it's dust. It just falls down. It doesn't really burn. So yeah, semi plausible at least.
yeah, the intensity of heat for the dust going through the atmosphere is less extreme, so it's possible that they would have entered that way, or they could have entered on the inside of a meteor of some kind.
There's a note somewhere in the chapter that like they find lichen inside lumps of granite, and like they can't figure out how the lichen got inside in the first place and how it survived sealed inside it.
Exactly. Yeah. Yeah. Like this stuff gets everywhere. And so it's very plausible that it could be on the inside of a meteor. And they also have done, like, they first had to do this sort of test to see, okay, could a lichen survive the forces involved if a like stellar body was blown apart into meteorites, right? Sorry, my terminology I'm sure is totally wrong, but asteroids, I guess it would be it. And they did those tests of like, okay, like, sort of like if the moon hit the Earth, what would that look like in terms of pressures? And yeah, the lichen could totally survive that. That was not an issue. It was only the question of reentry that was like, well, there's probably ways it could work, but the ways we can test are not going to give us any evidence that it's possible.
Yeah, that's another through line through this chapter is that like lichen are extremophiles. Like they not only survive but thrive in pretty intense environments and under pretty intense circumstances. Like they can be dehydrated, at which point they're not vulnerable to like cosmic radiation or anything, and then there's once they're rehydrated again, they just carry on as normal. It's pretty weird.
Yeah, they like put them on the outside of the International Space Station and bombarded them with cosmic rays, and they're sort of like, yeah, what's the big deal? Like, it's fine.
And, like they don't care if they get frozen and thawed out and heated up and all that kind of shit, which is pretty intense. There's a wonderful like segue then from this exobiology stuff, like through this biologist Joshua Lederberg, who became very concerned about this notion of like celestial contamination in that panspermia kind of register. But then he also discovered in a different instance that he discovered horizontal gene transfer, that bacteria can trade genes horizontally with each other, which again is this thing of like, it's contrary to the classic notion of biology where traits are inherited from your parents and only from your parents. It's a vertical transfer only, but like you can just, in the same way I could walk up to someone and grab their hat and wear it, like a bacteria can just grab a trait from another bacteria and use it.
Yeah, exactly. Yeah. It is pretty wild. And this is one reason why bacteria can mutate so quickly, right? It's because they don't actually have to go through generational change in order to have a change in traits. Because yeah, it's like you don't have this like interrupted mutation. You can have like continuous mutation. like continuous and punctuated, I guess, because you also have the factor of generational change.
Yeah, like, and it's very non-linear once you get to the horizontal stuff and being able to acquire traits wholesale. Yeah, very strange stuff. So, like, genomes had been considered as closed systems, but now we're seen to be cosmopolitan places where all kinds of mixing happens. Yeah, really leaving the concept open.
This seems to only be possible in humans if you have like what is it, like congenital twins? Is that the term? Where you're attached to each other in the womb.
I think there's some mention of that, and there's other mentions of things like chimerism and stuff in humans where people for various reasons are just made up of different genomes. Like one of the classic examples of chimerism is somebody who's given birth to a lot of kids will have the kids' DNA inside them because they've been host to them or whatever. So if you take a blood sample from her, there's a non-zero chance you'll end up getting one of her kids' like DNA fragments instead of hers or whatever. And that's just the tip of the iceberg. It gets weird. Well, I mean, it's very similar to this thing where, I don't know, like in the kind of culture wars at the moment, obviously with trans stuff, there's all this kind of shit about like the kind of like biological absolutism of like the XY chromosomes and stuff like that. But if you talk to an actual geneticist and they'll go, ridiculous. It turns out there's all kinds of weird and wacky shit that happens. Like, obviously people who appear to be completely normally cis or whatever in some gender or another or some sex or another have absolutely wacky fucking genes when you go look closely, but nobody bothered to look closely because why would you, So that's kind of analogous to what's going on here, or that's the high-full tip of a long history of the field of genetics being fucking levered open again and again by these discoveries that like shit is just so much weirder than you think it is.
Yes, yeah, that's right. This chromosomal nonsense that is peddled as like this is like a sexual essence or something, but the expressions of the chromosomes are like wildly diverse and complicated. And yeah, and I can totally see how there would be that kind of chimerism that could happen as well. It's just that it's to say that humans humans obviously contain bacteria, and so in that way we are perfectly capable of engaging in kind of this horizontal gene transfer. But in terms of our own genome, it's we're maybe a little bit more isolated on a spectrum than the bacteria are in terms of their rate and like permeability to horizontal gene exchange. It kind of makes me think of like the old like final or like saga games. These were like quite obscure Japanese RPGs where like I just remember being kind of blown away by this as a kid, because it was like the idea of bodies in those games was so fluid, where it was like you would start out a game as like, I am human fighter. It's like, okay, cool. But then it's like every time you beat a monster, it would be like, do you want to eat part of the monster? And then it's like, and it's like, well, I don't know, sure. And then your character just irrevocably becomes like a completely different species.
Oh, that rocks. That's so cool. Oh
my God. I was like, what the hell just happened? Or you could like equip items and just become like a cyborg. And yeah, it was wild in terms of that sort of like chimera like mutation of characters. And so whenever I read about this kind of stuff, I always go back and think about those childhood memories of just being like, what the hell?
Yeah, for sure, right? Yeah, and like that's definitely in the same keeping of like treating organisms as open systems, not like closed, predetermined things. There's a note kind of here that, like, is somebody, I think, like Trevor Goward is the researcher who kind of coins the phrase the likening rod effect, where, like, studying lichens invites these flashes of insight and these, like, supercharging your understanding, right? That, like, the study of lichen informs us about life in general, which I think is pretty cool.
Yeah. Well, it's like, what do you call it? It's like a liminal. It's like a liminal thing that whenever we examine it in some new depth or context, it displaces our certainties about what is going on with life and what the world is like. It's kind of like how, to use this like the likening rod is like a pun, right? It's like, lightning rod, right? To go with that sort of metaphor, it's like that idea that maybe life got started because you had like a electric charge from a lightning bolt hitting like a pool of water. Um, it's kind of like that, but with concepts about life, right? Is that you encounter lichen in some new way, and then you're just like, oh shit, like you just your whole mental universe becomes rearranged and mutated because of it.
Yeah, absolutely right. It's which is like, I don't know, like that's always been the satisfying and kind of compelling aspect of, like, philosophy, or just, like, studying anything really, is that, like, you can, because I mean, I guess, like, some listeners might be baffled as to why we're talking about fucking mushrooms on the show, but, like, it can really mess with your understanding of things, and you have to then reconfront everything you understand in new terms.
Yeah, because whatever you encounter in biology or develop in biology as like a new concept is just the beginning of the conceptual influence and effects of what you find, right? Like it will then become a metaphor that is used like everywhere. So it's this is just the starting point of all the changes that are wrought by that.
Yeah, and, like, the author is kind of quoting Trevor Goward here as, like, saying that, like, what this does, for him at least, is kind of raise new questions about life and about identity and about interkingdom collaboration. So it's an intuition pump to get you going on all kinds of new questions, like, what is it? What really is our relationship to the world? What the fuck? What are we even? If you start asking what a lichen is, you're not far from asking what you are. And this moves into some of the wackiest stuff I've ever fucking heard. Like the theory of what's the fucking word? Endosymbiosis. This is fucking nuts.
Yeah, this is some wild shit. This is it's very like Junji Ito body horror shit that is going on here. Yeah, no, this is so interesting.
Yeah, this is crazy. I love this. So, like, I guess the main idea here, like, he kind of does some setup with life being divided into three kingdoms, right? Like, you have bacteria, archaea, and eukarya. We are the latter kind, eukaryotes. And the same goes for fungi and plants and all kinds of shit. Like, there's a lot of eukaryotes out there.
Any multi-cell organism is a eukaryote. Yeah.
And one of the things that differentiates eukarya from bacteria or archaea is that eukaryotes have kind of like specialized, like larger cells with specialized structures like mitochondria, that are the energy furnaces of cells, and then plants and algae have like stuff like chloroplasts, which do the photosynthesis bit. So they're like bigger cells with specialized machinery in them. But the crazy thing is that it seems, and I mean, I think this is now accepted science, which is, again, it went through a cycle of being rejected and finally accepted. But the notion is that eukaryotes actually acquired their mitochondria by devouring a bacterium and taking its machinery wholesale, and that chloroplasts in plants came from similar bacteria, where like a multicelled organism just went hum on a bacteria that could photosynthesize and just took its stuff, and that's how you get plants.
Yeah, but it's even weirder than that, because devouring it kind of implies it was digested, which isn't what happened. It entered into the larger single-celled organism and just kind of took up shop there.
And continue to live, right?
It continued to live as an independent organism inside of it, like while still retaining its own identity. And so yeah, it's like having, it's like in Teenage Mutant Ninja Turtles with the robot that has Krang and living inside of it, right? Like it's like there is a whole ass different organism that has just been subsumed into a larger one. And this yeah, I mean, this whole thing really made me I don't know, we might get into it a bit later, I guess, but it made me think a lot about the idea of formal and real subsumption in Marx.
Mm-hmm. Oh, totally, right? Yeah.
Yeah, that like essentially the point at which the mitochondria are inside the other organism and are like contributing energy in some way, maybe by just doing their mitochondrial thing, or the chloroplasts doing the same thing. Well, not the same, but effectively they're fulfilling a similar role, right? In sustaining life. That's kind of like formal subsumption in Marx, right? Where you have the tools of another mode of production are taken up by capitalism or whatever, and are used but are not themselves altered, right? They remain, like the hammer remains the same hammer. It's just used in a capitalistic way. And then real subsumption is when the design of the hammer itself is changed so as to accommodate the imperatives of capital. Like it's in sort of like Feenberg's terms, it's like a more sophisticated technical code. And I think that this idea of what was it? Endosymbiosis, right? Endosymbiosis. I think it kind of problematizes the idea of formal and real subsumption, because although in the case of chloroplasts and mitochondria, like they have become so identified with their host cells that they effectively are part of them now and are not independent organism anymore. That's something that persists, like the independence of the mitochondria and the chloroplasts is something that persisted for a very long time. And if you think about like the horizontal gene structure, this kind of permeability, all of this sort of stuff, right? Like it the advantage of this like quote unquote real subsumption, where the subsumed thing becomes like inextricably tied to its host, is not as clear cut as Marx's thought experiment or sort of like theoretical construct would suggest, right? Like the real subsumption is like obviously superior because it's so integrated into the overriding mode of production and the technical code's all worked out, blah, blah, blah. But actually, if you look at these biological examples, it's very much less of a teleological shift in that direction as like a clear 100% advantage.
Yeah, absolutely. And I've kind of thought this for a while. I'm really glad you brought this up because it kind of like made a connection in my head that like, I think when you kind of study this kind of stuff and like, you know, cybernetics and stuff, you can really have like integrated information systems that still do have distinct components, and where, you know, a component can actually gain an advantage by keeping another component at arm's length, and that like totalization might not be more efficient than just letting, like, I mean, again, in a VSM kind of sense, right? Like allowing the component part autonomy is actually more efficient than trying to totalize it. And I think with Marx, and it just, I think the style at the time, the thing that was in the air was the totalization of capital. Like it was going to be an all-devouring force, which, I mean, it is, but I think it can kind of lead you into kind of dead ends like that, where you kind of assume an imperative to totalize that isn't actually there, really. Like, I think capital's really good at picking and choosing when it's going to integrate something and when it's going to keep it at arm's length.
Well, yeah, and exactly. And this kind of stuff, it sort of problematizes our understanding of what totality means. Because, yes, like the status of mitochondria or chloroplasts relative to their enveloping cells is like part of a totality in the sense that Marx means it. But at the same time, like, we have to acknowledge that there are all kinds of sort of interlopers in those totalities that do not, like, they don't necessarily pose a logical contradiction that must be resolved in the same way that is implied in like a Hegelian logic, right? Like there isn't a very strong teleological like gravity towards the resolution of contradictions into a like more or entirely integrated totality.
Yeah, like, I mean, like as Deleuze said, like nothing ever died of its contradictions, and certainly a lichen has never suffered from being two composite beings. You know, that like this, and like I think we encountered this in either vertical or horizontal as well. Like the difference between the Hegelian notion of like that contradictions must be resolved versus like a dynamic tension kind of model, where there's no good reason for dynamic tension to ever go anywhere or resolve in any particular way. There's no expectation of it. And similarly, like the fungi and the alga in the lichen are in a kind of dynamic tension with each other and a collaboration, but they also have like an open and promiscuous kind of relation where both of them can flake off and actually pair with other organisms, and, you know, other funguses and viruses can get into the lichen and contribute to it and do all kinds of wacky shit. And like there's no like God-given plan to resolve any of that, like resolve in quotes any of that stuff, you know. It's just dynamism, baby, you know.
Well, and kind of like with yeah, like if you look at the evolutionary history of lichen, you've had like fungus and algae that come together as lichen, but then they just at some point no longer are getting a mutual benefit from each other, and then they get a divorce and they go off and they're just algae and fungi again. They're not lichen. And that kind of like indeterminate directionality is sort of like if you look at, say, you know, like the possibility of capitalism forming in the Roman Empire or in the Chinese Empire or in Japan in the Edo period. It's like, yeah, like the components were kind of there and they were sort of tending in that direction, but it didn't end up happening, and it ended up going in a different direction. And that's sort of something really worth keeping in mind conceptually in terms of like, yeah, the sort of indeterminacy or like mutability, um changeability of these like social constructs, as well as like historical constructs, material constructs, as well as like biological relationships. um
Yeah.
yeah.
Yeah, absolutely. Like real living systems, whether that's biological systems or social systems, are usually more open and weirder than you think. And if you try to like nail it down as like, oh no, this whole thing is definitely going in a direction, and all these contradictory forces have to be resolved, you're probably wrong about it. So I mean, I think like the Hegelian influence throughout Marxism is a real kind of problem. It's foundational, but it's a huge problem.
Yeah, well, and it comes from like, the thinking of like Newtonian physics, right? That like, you can come up with these very simple logical formulas that are incredibly powerful in terms of their uh like efficacy in the world, right? That that it's just not that complicated, right? And so sometimes, sometimes there are overriding factors that just absolutely do push things in a direction, but like, to assume that that is the norm is very much in error, I think. Based on this kind of evidence, right? Is just like, no, that's like much more of an exception than it is the rule. Um,
Yeah, because I mean, like when we're dealing with these kind of biological systems, we're dealing with like non-reversible kind of processes, and like it actually more resembles like a thermodynamic process at a macro scale than it does the kind of billiard ball motion of Newtonian mechanics, right? Um, and yeah, when you're dealing with these kind of non-reversible thermal processes and all this kind of weird shit, like it's just probability and strangeness is going to be prevalent much more than predictability. Um, but yeah, I mean, this all this stuff is really intense, like that. Like, not only for lichen are a kind of emergent combinatorial organism, but like the same is actually true just of like eukarya in general. Like, go look at your hand. Every cell in there is actually a composite being, like of at least two distinct, semi-distinct, kind of, but like deeply collaborative creatures. Like, it's fucking crazy.
yeah, that's the whole thing, is like, you move from like, hey, these lichens sure are weird, to, oh wait, like maybe the entire concept of individuality is flawed. That's where you end up.
Absolutely. That is definitely where we end up, right? Because, I mean, there's a note here on the way there about like the way that like the fungal or that the lichen relationship is kind of contingent and promiscuous. That like they can for some lichen the fungal spores will just leave on their own and then find another algal partner to pair with, or any combination of those things will happen. It's a really weird thing where like it is an organism that is larger than the sum of its parts, but its parts still do remain semi-independent, but not really, but kind of.
Yes, yeah, they are conditionally independent, right? Or at least I guess you would say like, yeah, it sort of depends on the it's almost like holographic, right? It's like the perspective you take on it. It's like, is this an integrated system? Yes. Does it contain separable parts that don't necessarily need each other to exist? Also, yes. It's like they are doing these things continuously in time. They are like, quote unquote, likening as an activity because it is mutually beneficial to them. And they don't have to keep doing that, but they do keep doing that, like most of the time, because most of the time it continues to be beneficial. Yeah.
There's some notes here kind of slightly later in the chapter about that notion that like there's an ecological fit to this, that like fungi and algae do tend strongly to pair up, but the fitness of the pairing is kind of contingent on the match that they make for each other. And that, what's the phrase they use here? That it's the song, not the singer, that appears to be important. It's the metabolic song that they can sing together that makes the difference, and not really the particular identities of the particular species that are involved. So there's a promiscuity and a kind of openness and a cosmopolitanness to it all.
Yeah, it's like helpful to think about this stuff in terms of like process philosophy, right? Is like, you know, these are activities that are happening, and they are not they're not necessarily identical or like parted across time just because there's a continuity you can see there. The continuity does not imply like a substantial essence that exists beyond it.
Yeah, and there's just something about this little section that I don't know. This book is weirdly like erotic in some ways. Like, you know, there's like a sexual and romantic kind of through line to it all that I find very endearing and fun. Because yeah, I mean, sometimes when you're out on the prowl, it is really about the song, not the singer. You know.
Yes.
You know.
Yeah. And just sort of all the, what is it, the talk about like entanglement, right? And entangling as a kind of sexual sort of process. And so this is like, you know, this idea of like the lichen and the algae entangled with each other is sort of the first pass of almost it's not like sex in the sense of sex for reproduction. It's like sex in the sense of the act of sex, right? It's like an entanglement of bodies. And then we learned that like actually the dual hypothesis is wrong, and there are all kinds of other beings that are also entangled in this big lichen orgy that's happening. And that was so fascinating. It's like, wait a minute, what? Like they kind of like put that at the end of the chapter to sort of like blow your mind again, you know?
Mm-hmm. Yeah, it's nuts. It's more like the N hypothesis or whatever. Because like the basic trick here is that some researchers were had the idea to like grind up some lichen and sequence the genomes they found, and expected to find only 2. But then there was just a lot of other shit mixed in there, and they're like, hold on, there's actually quite a few different fungi and quite a few different bacteria all involved here.
And initially they just filtered it out as noise. Like, oh yeah, that's just contamination. And then they're like, wait a minute, what if it's not noise? What if it's signal? what if these are this specific type of quote unquote contamination is persistently present because it's actually a part of the lichen process, and it's not separable or isolatable down to a binary relationship. And it even says in the book here, like, lichens are queer beings that present ways for humans to think beyond a rigid binary framework. And this is the case not only because it breaks up our idea of individuality, or it breaks up the idea of competition among individuals, but it also breaks up our idea of binary relationships, because these like lichen polycules are everywhere, you know.
Yeah, they're absolutely they're everywhere, and then like, you know, it kind of like shifts our perspective again on identity, because then we start to think of ourselves as like, well, we're made up of human cells and all kinds of bacteria and viruses and fungi, and they're all collaborating together. And you get this notion of the holobiont as a kind of like, you know, hollow from holos, meaning whole, as like not just a symbiont, but a holobiont. And like, are we all holobionts? Like, are all organisms basically that? Because like, if you scale down to even eukaryotic cells, they're fucking holobionts. And it just seems wherever you look, this stuff is there.
Yes. Yeah. No, 100%.
It's nuts. So that's kind of the notion it leaves off on, is this challenge to notions of identity.
Yeah, there is one other thing I wanted to a quote that I wanted to bring up from the chapter that I thought was really interesting. It says, lichens are places where an organism unravels into an ecosystem and where an ecosystem congeals into an organism. They flicker between wholes, like quote wholes, and quote collections of parts. They like flicker between the two. They can't be seen as one or the other, right? And this whole idea of lichens as places, it just sort of reminds me of like, you know, in like the Kyoto school of philosophy, they have this idea of basho, which is place, and describing experience as a place, or reality as a place, as sort of a stage in which things happen. Or in Heidegger, you have this idea of the clearing, which may or may not be taken from the Kyoto school, but it's describing our whole sort of experience of the world in those terms. And it was really interesting to see that as like a metaphor or a way to think about these lichen, and just the idea of like, yeah, the lichen is not just an organism or an ecosystem, it's actually both. And yeah.
It's a city, yeah. I mean, I think it gives some reinforcement to the notions we got in neither vertical nor horizontal of like seeing social systems and movements as ecologies, as both, right? Like as things and ecologies of things at the same time, recursively.
Yeah, and exactly. And I think it kind of gets also back to that like disagreement that happened between like Beer and Maturana and Varela, right, over whether these cybernetic ideas that were found in biology about organisms could be applied to social systems. And when we think about it in these terms as like, you know, an ecosystem that congeals into an organism and an organism that unravels into an ecosystem, Beer's point of view seems much more plausible, right? Like once we have problematized the idea of the organism or of the individual, there is a greater scientific and conceptual apparatus to find some like clear bridge to what Beer was trying to do, without just sort of running on an intuition that it was correct. Yeah.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, absolutely. I guess there's also kind of one final point very close to the end here that under the kind of section on holobiont, that these assemblages always seem to be fraught with tension. This kind of is touching on what we were talking about earlier with like the formal and real subsumption, that tension and kind of like contrary dynamics within these things are very normal, right? So that one of these cosmopolitan lichen structures might contain bacteria or viruses or something that aren't exactly contributing in an obvious way to the health of the whole, but are not also obviously detrimental to it, or you might have contradictory dynamics between them, but that isn't again, nothing ever died of its contradictions, I guess, except if it gets swarmed with a virus that completely fucks it up. But, you know, it seems to be totally normal for there to be dynamic opposing tensions within a holobiont.
Yeah, no, completely. And that's like, you know, again, that was something that we see in like Brain of the Firm, right? Saying that these kind of internal antagonisms are very normal, but like, yeah, basically you can sort of do like the game theoretic payoff matrix for each actor you could identify inside of one of these holobionts, and like identify them as having distinct interests from one another. But because the song that they are singing is in some way ultimately or at least presently harmonious, it works out for them to cooperate.
Yeah, absolutely. Shall we do chapter 4, Mycelial Minds? This is a fun fucking chapter. It's all about LSD, psilocybin, and magic mushrooms.
Yeah, this is a fun chapter, but I think it is also the chapter that I maybe where the excerpt I originally read about this book, or sorry, from this book, in like I think it was in the Guardian or something, came from. And it feels to me, because like it feels to me as though this stuff about mushrooms is much more, or sorry, about fungi is much more widely known uh than the things that we've talked about so far in this book. So it was a chapter that was fun and interesting, but I kind of just blew through it and I didn't take any notes because it was like I wasn't there wasn't any like huge revelations or anything like super new that I came across here. It was just like, oh yeah, this is like psychedelics and fungi, and there were like interesting historical bits, but nothing mind blowing.
No, totally.
Ironically,
Well, yeah, that's the
ironically,
weird thing, right?
yeah. It's actually the more mundane, quote unquote, stuff about fungi is more mind blowing than all the stuff about psychedelics.
Yeah.
Yeah.
I mean, we can hit the high notes. I don't think I think it is a thinner chapter for those reasons. And but we can hit the interesting stuff, and I think a lot of it will be kind of familiar to a lot of our listeners anyway. So the chapter overall is about the relation between, well, like, again, it's all about relations, but the relation between fungi and specifically their effects on the nervous systems and the minds of other organisms, and the way that those turn into deep collaborations over time. One example we're given is the example of, what the fuck is it called? Ophiocordyceps unilateralis, which is the fungus that infects carpenter ants and turns them into zombies. A lot of folks will have heard of this before, but there is a fungus that takes over the body of ants and then forces them to climb up onto plants and like clamp their jaws in a very particular way, and then turns the body into just a big pile of fucking fungus and then sprays everywhere. That's part of it's part of the fungus's life cycle. It's a part of the carpenter ant's anti-life cycle, I guess. Part of its death cycle.
Yes, it is very much the what is it, the Boydian thing about like like accelerating your OODA loop while decelerating that of your victim.
Yeah, there's some interesting stuff here that like well, at least I found it interesting that apparently the fungus doesn't like take over the brain of the ant. It just sort of bypasses it.
Yeah, this is like the most horrific thing about it. It is very like I have no mouth but I must scream. Like it is like, yeah, the fungus doesn't bother with the brain. It just puppets the ant's muscles and forces it to do these things while it's like, a prisoner in its own body, yeah.
It like attaches to the muscles directly and then issues electrochemical signals to more or less just pilot it directly, and it's fascinating and weird and quite horrifying.
Because it's like it's the fungus is like heliocentric, or sorry, heliotropic, right? It follows the light to get to exactly the right altitude on the tree in order to maximize its spore dispersion, and then it just it just makes a big mushroom out of the ant's head and sprays the fungus everywhere, and all the other ants that were following it around, because their fellow ants become infected. You know, it's some real horror shit.
Yeah, and well, I guess one of the things there is like the precision with which the fungus is able to control the organism. It's
Yeah,
kind of crazy.
it's on a clock. It's on a clock. They all do it at the same time of day because they're following a light-based program.
Yeah, it's nuts. And so like that's it's kind of how you get into some of the interest in the effects of like fungal chemical compounds on like humans or whatever, you know. There's a lot of stuff there, and then one of the bigger kind of points that's brought up is the stoned ape hypothesis that it might have been for humans or for early hominids the encounter with magic mushrooms or psilocybin mushrooms specifically might have been the thing that kick-started self-reflection, language, spirituality, and just kind of caused all this shit to happen.
Yes, yeah, it was like a sort of irrevocable mental, psychological, and evolutionary break, um, uh, in human history, is sort of the hypothesis, which is something that's like sort of supported, I guess, by the fact that, like, you know, it's like once you have like a feral child that hasn't been socialized in any way, they can never become socialized, because they've missed a critical period of socialization. So it's conceivable that, like, you know, people were tripping, they got into some like weird different mode of thought, and then that became a social phenomenon, uh by way of being shared from, you know, one individual to another to another to another, even without direct exposure to the psilocybin.
Yeah, right. I guess that's a kind of is a big part of the chapter is kind of going over some of the effects that it has on minds, right? Like what when it's put under a microscope, what it seems to do is deactivate, I think, what's called the default mode network in the brain. Like, so when you're doing your usual executive function stuff, just like milling around and putting cups on shelves or whatever, that's the default mode network, and it kind of it keeps things on the rails. It keeps things on the straight and narrow. If you turn that off, things get weird, and it's those novel connections and those like unexpected patterns of thought that are the consequence of taking. So the psilocybin and the LSD turns off the default mode network and then opens up the gates of madness. You know.
Yeah, and like this was so interesting because it's essentially like it's kind of saying that, like, the reason why people with ADHD are so good at making mental connections between things is because our default mode network is so weak, and and because it's so weak, we're always like, we're sort of like constantly microdosing without microdosing. Like our default mode network is always a little bit high, you know? And that is that's pretty interesting, right? Like when you think about, you know, sort of hypotheses that we've talked about before about, like, you know, the ability of people with ADHD to sort of like think around problems, and kind of engage in this like exploratory mode that we saw with the hyphae variations in the earlier part of the book. And then you think about that in terms of the default mode network, and also about the Stone Ape hypothesis, right? That like this could just be a evolutionary adaptation that pushes you a little bit more in that stone direction than your neurotypical person would be as a result of having the sort of like socialized results of people being stoned thousands and thousands and thousands of years ago. Like, yeah.
Well, here's a fun feedback loop for you, right? It's the ADHD hominid who was more likely to try out the mushroom and then go, oh my god, it's full of stars, and have to tell everyone else about it.
Yeah, well, yeah, and I mean, you can kind of see in the language that people use about ADHD, right? Like, oh, this person is a space cadet, or they have their head in the clouds, which are kind of similar. Is kind of similar metaphors or imagery that you would use to describe somebody who's high.
Yeah, totally. There's some interesting stuff then about how LSD and psilocybin can and has been used to treat depression and anxiety and all kinds of things. And like it is the fact that it turns off the default mode network and allows for novel connections that seems to be the cure. So that, like, in the cases of, like, seemingly untreatable depression, the default mode network, like, the being on the rails is the black iron prison that, like, keeps you down. And blasting it open a little bit is the thing that allows for the cure to happen.
Yes. Yeah. Specifically, like, blasting it way open, right? Because the thing they talk about is that, like, in terms of psychedelic treatments, you can't, like, in terms of a therapeutic approach, you can't approach them in the same way that you would with a standard pharmaceutical as a mechanistic. You have this problem. I will provide you, like, the key that fits into that problem hole, and then we turn it, and then you're better, right? You can't think about it in those terms, because the thing that is actually therapeutic to people is the spiritual experience that they go through, and you can't invalidate that as purely epiphenomenal to the efficacy of the drug, because it's actually the thing that is efficacious, right? Yeah.
I think as they put it here, it's like brains don't have experiences, minds do. And it's the cure is at the register of experience, not just a kind of like, well, this tweaked to the dopamine receptors a little.
Yeah, and you have people who go through these trips. They start out as, like, hardcore materialists, and then they become hardcore idealists, because they can't reconcile what they experienced with a materialist worldview, because it was such a trip, right? Yeah, but it's like, yeah, they can't reconcile it, but at the same time, it doesn't change the fact that we have a very good materialist account of why this happens.
Well, it's not a coincidence this happened immediately after you took a bite of that mushroom,
Yeah. We've even isolated the active ingredient, like it's like, it's profoundly material, but people often can't reckon with it in those terms. Yeah, and I've had this argument with people quite a bit. It seems to be, I don't know, a thing that, I don't know. It seems like idealism is, like, coming back as a trend, or as in vogue right now, and I'm so confused by it, because it's like, I mean, I think everything we've seen on this show in terms of talking about nature and reality shows that, like, if you take a materialist point of view, but you admit of things like emergence, like, it's not the billiard ball universe or the clockwork universe that you're describing when you describe matter or material reality. It's actually something that's, like, way stranger than that. It's like, the materialist option is the more bizarre option, and the idealist option is less radical, because it only is going to get you the things that are deducible from human thought, which is pretty fucking limited compared to the unbelievable variety of reality when you take into account things like, like computational limitations, and emergence, and just the sort of bottomless abyss of investigation of material reality, right?
Yeah, it's nuts, right? Because like I feel like yeah, I think like we might be a kind of in a sort of rare breed or whatever. And that like I think of myself as a kind of like a kind of emergent mechanist or something, or like a computationalist. But like the thing that closes the loop is that like once you admit that brains are material information systems as well, and therefore like ideas or like patterns of thought are information patterns in the material universe, then the kind of distinctions start to break down a little, and you can see how the layers of emergence really stack up. And
yeah, well, simultaneously not having to follow a rule where mental events must be reducible to material processes, because it's simply like we do not have the requisite variety
yeah,
to do that. We can't actually think that. And because it's like what Beer says in Brain of the Firm, right? Is that if you think about like incompleteness, it's like we have a level of description that is appropriate and in some ways extended, like we talk about with this stoned ape hypothesis, to what it means to be a human, I don't know, being. But that in no way suggests that we can provide an exhaustive description of any other level of complexity that is internally consistent with itself, right?
yeah. I think that's why the information stuff and like computationalism is so important there, because like you then discover like information limits and the way that information barriers form, because like you need to use more than 10 neurons to think about 10 neurons.
Yes,
And
yes.
that just kind of escapes from you very quickly. And so the act of thinking about the neurons, it is a layered like electrochemical, mechanical, thermal system all the way down. But like your patterns of thought are real material things, but there's an informational limit on how like it can turn back on itself and it can recurse, but there's a limit on the recursion.
Yeah, you could provide accounts of things that are at a different level of thought or being, but necessarily there will be variety attenuation involved in order to reduce them to something that you can articulate in your mode of thought. Um, and that's okay, right? That just means you've rendered it functional to your mode of thought, but it doesn't mean you've provided a complete or an exhaustive description, because you absolutely have not. Because there are no exhaustive descriptions, right? It's just everything is incomplete.
And I mean, like, similarly, I think, like, if we get to, like, the problem of determinism, like, the universe could be hard deterministic on some level. It could be. But you're never going to have the information required to work that out, so you might as well continue on as if it's contingent. Like, moment to moment, you as an information system have limited information, and you are always playing that game of trying to guess what's coming next, and so probability is always going to be a thing for you. Even if it turned out somehow that the universe was just a thing on a tape somewhere, it would still subjectively be true that it doesn't seem that way.
Yeah, and if our scientific understanding of physics, information theory, and so on is in any way accurate, there is no level. I mean, it may not be, right? But there is no level whatsoever at which you could validate determinism. Like, even if you were at a far higher level of cognition or information processing than a human being, it's still incomplete. And there are things about being human that you just would not be able to exhaustively understand, in the same way you wouldn't be able to exhaustively understand the existence of like a subatomic particle configuration.
Yeah.
Um,
Yeah, and like it's just like those limitations are very important, and like if somehow it turned out, I mean, it's not something you'd ever know, but like if the truth was actually that the universe was a program on a tape, well, you thinking about the tape is on the tape too. You are inside the tape. You're not going to find a way outside it.
yeah, and I mean, in terms of like, you know, reconciling spirituality with this stuff, like in terms of like, you know, having this trip and being like, wow, this is so mind blowing. It's so like all these categories have melted in my mind, and there's a sense of like, you know, oneness and all of this kind of stuff. Like, I think that understanding reality in this way makes you, I don't know, at least in my experience, it makes you more amenable to being conceptually flexible. It doesn't mean you have to agree with every woo concept you come across, but it allows you to be a little bit more like promiscuous in your thinking, right? Where it's like you know it's like for the longest time, right? You know, as after the Enlightenment, or even probably like in, you know, the confines of like the Catholic Church, prior to the Enlightenment, where there was a really strong focus on rationality and so on. Um, these like stories of like mythological creatures becoming other creatures, or of chimeras, or you know, these like ways of understanding the world in terms of like mutation and hybridity were seen as like uh, oversimplified primitive speculation, right? But actually, although it is not in exactly the same terms, of course, a lot of our contemporary science has validated that worldview more so than the one that presumed to be uh, correct because of its focus on rational analysis and categorization, right? Um, and so, like, if you can have that sort of openness of mind, it's going to keep you from getting into some conceptual roadblocks that you might otherwise not have. And so, you know, you could kind of entertain the idea. It's like, well, if we have these different like levels of information processing, you know, there is nothing that rules out necessarily that like, you know, great old ones exist, like these like beings beyond our understanding, eldritch existences like angels or whatever. Like I mean, probably not angels in any sense that we would describe them, but you know, there could be these, you know, cognitive existences that are so vast that we can't even see them. um, but we have no way of telling, right? Yeah.
Well, I mean, like we've already in this book had encounters with kind of weird cognitions, right? Like that if fungi do thought, which they really seem to do, then it kind of throws open the gates to all kinds of shit. Like, does a planet think? If it's an information system, it fucking might do, you know?
It might, right? The Gaia hypothesis might be true. It doesn't seem to be provable because it's such a complex phenomenon, but we might find evidence it's true, right? Like we might find traces of its truth, and then whether it is true or not becomes a matter of sort of like aesthetic disposition, right? Of do you tend to find that fits with your sensibility of how the world works, because it's not accessible to us to actually comprehend something like that. We can't definitively prove it.
Yeah. And the lack of comprehension is, for me at least, I think where it tips over into a sort of spirituality, I guess. Like, I mean, I generally don't describe myself as a spiritual person, but the hyper complexity of the universe, I think, is awe inspiring. And you know, I kind of, maybe this will illustrate it, but like I was watching something ages ago where it was like something about the rainforest, whatever, and there was an interview with some indigenous people, like, and this young woman was going on about like how we have to protect the trees because spiritual reasons, like they're the home in which the ancestors live and all that kind of shit. And it's like, I don't mean to shit on her or indigenous people or those traditions or anything, but like to me it seemed really odd because she's saying we have to protect the trees because they're the residency of the ancestor spirits, and I want to protect them because they're trees. Like trees are sufficiently miraculous as
Right.
bizarre information systems and just miraculous beings. The fact that they fucking exist is fucking credible in the beginning, and I kind of don't feel the need to mix in ghosts and shit like that to like make it special. I think it's quite special in itself, and like everything we've read in this book is really fucking special. Like fungi think, that's fucking nuts. You know what I mean? I think that there's plenty of wonder in nature, and it's disgusting amounts of complexity. that's kind of enough for me to trigger that, you know?
Yeah, exactly. And it's like one does not necessarily invalidate the other as a proposition, right? It can be true that both it is the home of the ancestor spirits, and also trees are in themselves. They have inherent value as these incredible things, right? Um, but it also could be the case that you believe in one or the other. And yeah, I mean, again, it's sort of like what they describe. I think it's in this chapter, right, with Dawkins, in terms of like, are mushrooms that produce psilocybin uh, in a kind of evolutionary relationship with humans that is analogous to the ant zombie fungus that we talked about earlier, the cordyceps. Yeah, is that an analogous relationship or not? And the author is arguing like it kind of comes down to your aesthetic sensibilities as to what counts as valid and not in terms of relationships between beings, because there's sort of evidence you could put in both directions, and it comes down to like, how do you define these terms more so than an open and shut case.
Right. It seems to come down to, I think he uses Whitehead and Russell, where one says, you know, the world looks like what it seems to on a fine noonday or whatever, and the other says, well, it seems to me that it's whatever it looks like when you wake from sleep in morning, right? Like it's, do you aesthetically value like clarity, or are you a bit more amenable to dream logic?
Yes, yeah, it was Whitehead, the sort of Russell's teacher and kind of like infamous process philosopher for writing very hard to understand books. Um, uh, he was trying to explain the sort of like difference in sensibilities between himself and Russell to Russell. It's like, the reason why I don't agree with you about this is because I view the world, at that sort of like early dawn, when you've just woken up and everything's a little bit fuzzy and indistinct, and sort of impressionistic. And you view the world in sort of the clear light of noon where everything is very sharply defined, right? And completely illuminated. Yeah, that's a pretty good way of putting it, I think. It's interesting, like in the degree to which, like, yeah, like at some level, science is an aesthetic endeavor. Yeah.
Yeah, I mean, like, I think this earlier in the book that it was kind of touched on as well, that like the kind of, you have to use your intuition at some point, that like you're just not going to get, like, a pure analysis doesn't get you very far. You have to and like by those criteria, I think like Dawkins lays out 3 criteria for like an extended phenotype, right? So broadly, you could say that a beaver's extended phenotype is its dam, right? Like it's it's a thing that's not manifested in its body; it's manifested in its external behavior, but it is a part of the genome, right? Like they're pre-programmed to build dams. But if it's to qualify as this, it has to be that there has to be like variation, and that the variation has to have some sort of fitness, like that better.
If you make better dams, you are more likely to reproduce. Right? Yeah.
Mhm. And so for the cordyceps fungus, it seems to tick all the boxes, right? That there will be instances of the fungus that are better or worse at controlling the ants, and the better success means they'll propagate more. So yeah, extended phenotype. Also, like the cordyceps seems to be strictly dependent on its relation to the ant. Like if all the ants went extinct tomorrow, it would probably go extinct too. Maybe, who knows? It might figure out a different trick.
Yeah, on what failing some, unanticipated mutation. Yeah.
By contrast, like human beings have started to cultivate psilocybin mushrooms and so on, and are proliferated them quite a bit, and the mushrooms are probably quite pleased by this. But if humans went extinct tomorrow, they'd probably be okay. Like they'd figure out what to do.
Yeah, they're at that stage of like formal subsumption, quote unquote, right? Like this is a functional but in some ways accidental relationship between these two beings. The other thing though is that the point about fitness, human beings don't seem to value psilocybin producing mushrooms in terms of some like quantifiable metric of fitness, right? Like people don't seem to be like, they don't necessarily value them according to like, I want to get the most high I possibly can, like give me just the biggest dose, just blow my mind, right? Like there's a sort of like, connoisseur variation between mushrooms, but it isn't like a clear criterion for fitness that can be identified in terms of these ones will be selected as part of this relationship and therefore will be more fit to continue to propagate their genes.
Yeah, I mean, these trips are famously non-quantifiable, right? Like, it's just, you can't really put it into words. But if you soften your focus a little, it is a very interesting entanglement that they've gotten themselves into, whether there's a hard dependency or not.
And it has enormously increased the number of mushrooms that exist in the world, right? Because of this relationship that exists between us humans and the mushrooms, we figured out what they do to our minds, and we like it. Well, many of us like it, and so we've got to work trying to cultivate them in the most effective ways possible, and have produced truckloads and truckloads and truckloads of mushrooms, which is very different from the way that they function in their natural environment, in which we originally found them.
So, like, the cordyceps fungus very obviously wears the ant like a glove, as a tool. Do psilocybin mushrooms wear our minds like a tool? Maybe not, but who gives a shit? It's an interesting thought.
Yeah, some people think they do, right? Like some people like think that if you are tripping in a specific way, you can like talk to the mushroom. Um, yeah, it's like it's like Final Fantasy VII, and you're communicating with the life stream or whatever, right? You're connecting into the psychic network of the mushroom world. Um, uh, but is that something we can substantiate? Not as far as we can see. So it doesn't seem that there is a like strong puppeting relationship or like backpacking relationship, even if we accept the stoned ape hypothesis as true. Because that's like a very intermittent kind of relationship that exists between humans and these mushrooms. Because for like most human beings for most of history have not had access, or sorry, have not consumed psilocybin for ritual or psychological purposes. We've had all kinds of other drugs that we've engaged with, but if there was this relationship that existed at some point in our evolutionary history, it was lost for most of humanity until, like, the 20th century, when it became globalized again. Or yeah, it became globalized. Yeah.
Yeah. So yeah, maybe. Who knows? One way or the other, it has been substantial and significant in its impact on us, and that's kind of all you can really expect. It's not as integral to our life cycle or death cycles as it is for the ants, but it's a big deal. Chapter 5, Before Roots. This is another one that's absolutely fascinating, in that it gets into the origins of terrestrial life on the surface of the planet, out of the water, and the deep collaboration between fungi and plants. They can't live without each other.
It's sort of like examining plants from the perspective of fungi, like defining plants in terms of fungi, their relationship to fungi, as opposed to seeing the fungi as something that just kind of happens to be there in the root system.
Yeah, this is kind of opposite to what we got in Tree Stories, or it elaborates substantially on Tree Stories, that we get the fungal perspective. Yeah. So the general story here is that many, many moons ago, the Earth was a desolate place. There was life in the oceans, but on land, which would be unrecognizable to us now, it was just rocky bullshit, and it was irradiated and horrible, and there was basically no living things up there.
Yeah, it's kind of like if you look at, fresh magma that is cooled and produced volcanic rock, right? That was just kind of the whole world, because there was no soil anywhere.
Yeah. This is the story how soil comes about. So like bacteria, algae, fungi, and all kinds of weird fish were stuck in the ocean, but there would be an evolutionary pressure towards getting onto land, because then you get access to unfiltered sunlight, and there's a lot of rock up there, and if you can break open the rock and get nutrients inside, then you're in for a really good time. Algae and bacteria couldn't do that on their own. It was the fungi collaborating with them that allowed them to actually move out of the water as weird composite organisms that resembled, or like they were the beginnings of what would become plants. These early algae, planta-like structures didn't have roots. They had fungus acting as roots instead.
Yeah. This is the part where they talk about entanglement, right? And it says this wasn't sex. Fungal and plant cells hadn't fused and pooled their genetic information, but it was sexy. And I was like, well, it really depends on your definition of sex, right? Is sex about reproduction, or is it not? Is it about other things? Because if it's about other things, it is sex, right? It's not. I mean, maybe in a biological sense, or the sense that, like, I don't know, very strange people would follow it's not sex, but you could definitely think about it that way if you are.
There's a deep intimacy and a sensuousness to this whole relation, right? But yeah, so like the combination of these organisms were able to crack open the ability to live on land and give rise to the entirety of terrestrial life, really. And the trick is that the plant half of the composition can photosynthesize. It can pull carbon out of the atmosphere. It can pull light and produce sugars and bits of carbon and such, while the fungus can dig around and break up a rock, get access to phosphorus and all kinds of weird shit like that. And they can exchange these things with each other. There's some really weird numbers here that, like, for a plant will give up about 30% of its sugars and carbon and shit like that to the fungus. and the fungus will exchange it for, phosphorus and all kinds of stuff that it's pulling out of the soil.
Yes. Yeah. There's constant exchange happening between fungi and root systems. And well, plants more generally, but through the root systems, right?
Yeah, these mycorrhizal fungi. And again, like the chapter is called Before Roots because all this stuff was happening before plants had specialized root structures. They seem to have grown roots primarily as a docking station for the fungi, and then later developed the ability for the roots to mimic what the fungi were doing anyway. But then, even then, the fungi still outperform these mycorrhizal fungi. Outperform the roots by quite a bit. Like you still can't do without the fungus.
Yeah, well, this is so interesting, right? Because it says like mycorrhizal hyphae are 50 times finer than the finest roots and can exceed the length of a plant's roots by as much as 100 times. They came before roots and range beyond roots. So it's kind of like, yeah, roots can do hyphae fungi like things, but their efficacy is enormously increased by engaging in exchange with the fungi.
Yeah. So I mean, this is very like what we saw with the lichen, the mutual benefit, but like this is dialed way up to 11, and these are organisms we're more familiar with, I guess. That they're kind of farming each other, right? That like the fungi are farming the plants and the plants are farming the fungi in a mutually beneficial relationship. It is very fucking strange.
Yeah, well, it's so complex too, right? Because we're not just talking about like a given type of fungi, we're talking about like many different types, and their interactions with each other are highly dependent on the very specific environmental context they're in, right? The composition of the rock, the soil, the humidity, the light, the other plants in the area, the other fungi in the area. Like all of this stuff is relational. And, at the end of the chapter, they sort of talk about how, like, scientists who study fungi, like mycologists, can only sort of, with their best efforts, get at the edges of these sort of relationships in very controlled laboratory circumstances because it's impossible to, at least with the technology we have now, it's impossible to see it like in its natural context. There's just so much going on that it becomes way too high variety, way too noisy, and you cannot figure out what's happening without seriously isolating the actors in these networks, right?
I mean, and if you're doing that kind of reduction stuff, then you're just like you're harming the thing that you're trying to study. So like, okay, I want to study the mycorrhizal stuff that's going on in this forest. Well, what's your fucking plan for that? Dig it all up. It's not a forest anymore if you do that,
Yeah, no, exactly. Like we don't have non-destructive ways of intervening in that system in order to like render it comprehensible. And so it's sort of like you either have the components or you have the system, but you can't have both.
You can't have both at the same time. It's an uncertainty problem, certainly. There's some really interesting stuff here I found about like market exchange within these networks and these relationships, which I could not have guessed was going on.
Yeah, it's very interesting to me. So we have this researcher Kears, and it says Kears's findings are surprising because they suggest that neither plant nor fungus is in complete control of the relationship between the two. Between them, they are able to strike compromises, resolve trade offs, and deploy sophisticated trading strategies.
In one set of experiments, she found that plant roots were able to supply carbon preferentially to fungal strains that provided them with more phosphorus. In return, fungi received more carbon from the plant, supplied it supplied it with yet more phosphorus. Exchange was in some sense negotiated between the two depending on the availability of the resources. Kears hypothesized that these reciprocal rewards have helped to keep plant and fungal associations stable over evolutionary time. Because both partners share control of the exchange, neither partner would be able to hijack the relationship for their own exclusive benefit. Although both plants and fungi tend to benefit from the relationship overall, different species of plant, no, that last part is not, I don't think, relevant. What I think I wanted to bring up there was that this is, now it sounds like this is giving us sort of a micro level demonstration of why markets are necessary. And because this is the result of laboratory experiments and hypotheses, like thought experiments, probably like doing sort of like game theory payoff matrices. I'm hesitant to, well, just because of my own sensibilities as well, I'm hesitant to say, oh yeah, like clearly this naturalizes markets in a way that is a slam dunk, to say like clearly because nature does this, it is the best way to do it. And even that we could say that is actually exactly what's happening, because we always know that there are complexities to these situations that we don't grasp, right? And this stuff is super interesting. Like I find it fascinating, but I think it's tempting to use this as a way to naturalize the validity of markets as a definitive mode of social organization. And I just think that would be overly hasty.
Yeah, absolutely right. That is the kind of risk there. And like, I mean, I think there's even a note here somewhere that like, you know, they've observed that a fungus, like if it has access to like a dense patch of phosphorus and then access to less dense patches, it'll move the phosphorus in the network in its own network. It'll move it from the dense area to the area where phosphorus is more scarce, apparently to gain access to more carbon. Like it does a cost, supply demand cost thing.
It computes. It's a biological computer, right?
Which is fucking remarkable, right? But it's kind of like, if you're trying to guess at the motivation, it could also be that it just does that anyway. Like it tends to primarily favors equalization of phosphorus across the network in the first place, and then secondarily happens to get a higher payoff of carbon exchange from the plants at the other end of the network. It would be too much of a projection to say that it's definitely money-grubbing behavior on the part of the fungi, but it's also like it is there as an observed phenomenon, so it's something we are challenged by.
Yes, I think that, yeah, I think the thing is they talk about it in terms of buy low, sell high. But if it is actually true that the network is equalizing the phosphorus, it's not really the same thing as seeing a really good trading opportunity and going all in on it. Like, you know, if you see there's a massive shortage of rice in this country, so let's send our entire rice hoard, our stock, to that country before anyone else, so that we can make the maximum profit. This doesn't seem to be exactly that. It seems to be exploring opportunities, but not necessarily engaging in what we would see as like profit maximizing behavior. It might be optimizing for something else that also implies like increasing the number of trading partners, right? There's something there that isn't quite reducible to buy low, sell high.
Right, because it doesn't seem to have like a labor relationship there. Like it's not, it's not like it's not like a plant proletariat that is at the mercy of the fungal kind of overlords who harvest surplus value.
No, no, no. It's much more like the sort of like neoclassical fable of the market, or the idea of like the primitive mode of production in Marx, right? Where it's just you just have these small holders and they make their little thing and they exchange it amongst each other. Like it's not you don't have like capitalism, right? You don't it's what do you call it? It's not a market where everyone is a price taker, because you can direct your resources towards more profitable ventures and set quote unquote prices or exchange rates accordingly. But it is also like a market where there are an enormous number of actors, to the degree that monopolizing doesn't seem to be possible.
Mm-hmm. That's a really key thing here. That like there's a very promiscuous relationship going on here. That a given plant might be in contact with many fungal networks, and each fungal network is in contact with many plants. And here's a weird thought, right? Like maybe it turns out that neoclassical economics is actually true for the mycorrhizal networks, but it works, and it actually does work for them, but only because they don't have surplus value and the law of value and labor, right?
Yeah. I mean, there's some things about it that are just simply impossible, but there's a kind of rhyming between the like the sort of ideal fantasy of the market that neoclassical economics presents, and this very diverse market that you see exist in these mycorrhizal environments and relationships.
Yeah, it's just a funny thought, and I think the key difference really is that like this is what kind of makes us step back from the trap of kind of overgeneralizing this to human society, is that like the plant and the fungi, their relationship doesn't have the law of value or like a captive sort of side of the equation that is at the mercy of the other, and so maybe mutually beneficial exchange is more true for them than it could ever be for us, under capitalism.
Yeah.
I don't know, weird shit, There's a lot of this chapter then it's about the impact of these relationships on the rest of the ecosystem, or the rest of the planet, really. Obviously, the emergence of this relationship is kind of foundational to the emergence of terrestrial life, like above water on the fucking planet, which is pretty remarkable. But like, it also seems to have a big impact on climate, because like once plants and fungus get really good at this kind of shit, the amount of carbon dioxide in the atmosphere plummets, and you get a mini ice age. The efficiency, I think what's it called, the symbiotic efficiency of the relationship, the kind of efficiency of the extraction of phosphorus in particular, and the exchange into plants, seems to be a dial that modulates the composition of the atmosphere.
Yes. Yeah. Well, yeah. And like, what is it? This is just one of those examples where like the evolution of life on Earth happened in such a way that was like utterly catastrophic. I think there's been other cases of that where it's like, oh yeah, then they just sort of like went in a runaway development direction, and then like almost everything on Earth was killed, right? Like it, like the climate crisis that we are in currently is by no means the first example of life on Earth utterly fucking itself over and causing catastrophic changes to its environment.
There's been algal blooms that choked themselves out. There's been this shit where like
Oh yeah, I think that was the one I was thinking of. Yeah.
So remarkable stuff, but yeah, I guess there's kind of a notion here, like it gets into a lot of climate crisis stuff, and especially with agriculture, that like modern agriculture has fucking ruined this relationship, right? That like
it's so fucked. It's so fucked. Yeah. I mean, this is not something that they actually get into the chapter, but like or in the chapter, but I couldn't help but think like, earlier in the chapter they provide this definition of what a plant is, right? And it says that like plants don't have roots. One of my undergraduate professors confided to a class of astounded students. They have fungus roots, mycorrhizas. Right? If that's true, and we've created these varieties of plants that are designed to live in a hyper nutrient saturated soil in the context of a very impoverished mycorrhizome, then essentially those aren't plants. If you follow that definition, they're not plants anymore, right? They are something we've made that is derived from plants, but can only exist in like the context of industrial agriculture and like sort of coexists with industrial agriculture in a way that is like actively destroying mycorrhiza that would support real plants.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, right. There's these dysfunctional relationships that like because there's work being done here to work on improving the situation, like get these more robust relationships going again for the health of the soil and get all that good shit happening. But then, like, it turns out it's kind of hard to coax some of these plants and fungus into cooperating again because they've become spoiled.
Well, I mean, it's like it's one of those things where like you think you're fucked, and then you have the realization of like you didn't even know how fucked you were, right? Like this is so much worse than we anticipated, right? Because yeah, they can try to isolate and reproduce like basically like sort of what they call like probiotic yogurt for the soil, right? Where it's like we've isolated this one type of gut bacteria, and it's in this yogurt, and if you eat it, you're going to be healthy. And of course, it doesn't do a goddamn thing, right? Because it's like, no, actually, your gut flora is incredibly complex, and dumping a whole bunch of one type of microbe into that gut flora does not actually improve things, right? Because it's like we said, right, that the situations in which these mycorrhizomes exist and the relationships that are implied with them are so specific to the place they're in and the very specific configuration of forces among the actors. Because like they describe how you can have microbes like fungi that are conceived of as quote unquote cooperative fungi. But if you put them together with other so-called cooperative fungi, they actually switch over into being antagonistic and competitive with each other. And there is no cooperative essence to these fungi. It's simply the product of a network of relationships that when you go in and you do industrial agriculture on the land, on the soil, whatever it is, whatever biome it is, you just like eradicate that entire network, and you're having to like start from scratch, right? But then the problem is like the computational problem of like how to get, like, people joke about how like it's like impossible to have like a healthy polycule because there's so many moving parts, right? But like obviously they do exist, and but that's like really really hard to make happen. But like imagine if it was like a polycule of like 2,000 people and you had to engineer the specific computational result where like it works together more or less, as opposed to starting from like two or three. That's the kind of problem that we find ourselves in trying to restore the soil. And then on top of that, there's some types of fungi for the soil that are easy to produce en masse and will be sold by manufacturers as like, oh, you can like put this in your soil and it's going to make everything great, like it's going to organically restore your soil, blah blah blah. But it's the same thing as the probiotic yogurt. It just happens to be the type of fungi that is easy to produce, and might be useful, but it doesn't mean we can easily produce all of the types of fungi that we might need to provide a solution.
Yeah. And so within the frameworks of capitalism and industrial agriculture, those results are always going to be disappointing, right? Because you're just not going to have the consistent, like, I think trying to restore these kind of relationships would, improve the health of the ecosystem, would improve yields, but it's not going to do it consistently in a way that's like easily replicable everywhere. Because these relationships figured themselves out over the course of millennia, or fucking way longer than that, right? They've been figuring themselves out for a while. Then we came along and within about 50 fucking years destroyed it all. And then what's your plan for fucking getting that back? It's like it took 1 million fucking years to create it. You're not going to get it done in a day, right?
Yeah, I mean, it's not even necessary. Like it's not even necessarily 1 million years. Like, it could be like they describe. A new volcanic island comes about and it's freshly colonized. But the mix of actors in that network isn't something we can really synthesize. We might be able to encourage like the fungi to spread to these areas from other areas that are healthier, but we can't really like develop a package that we could just deploy into a absolutely deprived soil and get good results.
Yeah. They seem to be like cats, right? That like they'll do it on their own terms. Anybody who's ever owned cats or worked with them is like, you can't make them do shit. Like they'll fucking do whatever they want, and like you can maybe coax them a little in the direction you want, but they're just gonna hiss at you and do whatever they please.
Well, yeah, and then it's like, well, you got to go get plants from the seed bank because those are plants that actually like live in healthy soil and they don't live in like a soup of fertilizer and Roundup. Um, uh, and the thing is, like, we were talking when we talked about like the half Earth socialism game, right? Like they were providing sort of compelling reasons for why relying on organic agriculture is a pretty poor way to meet the food needs of the world in a way that is space effective and also uh, climate effective, like in terms of providing, yeah, the right amount of inputs and outputs, so an efficient amount of inputs and outputs that overall will work towards balancing the climate situation. But when you look at something like this, it's like oh yeah, but actually we don't have a choice, you know, because the industrial one is the problem with the industrial one is not only that it creates like monocultures and pollution and all that sort of thing. It also massively deteriorates the soil because uh, because you have all the fungus die out. The fungal connections, the sticky fungal connections that hold the soil together, uh, through a really aggressive tilling and then also chemical treatment, die out, and they no longer are holding it together. So it's much easier for it to just blow off, and you lose an enormous amount of soil every year just by doing basic agriculture, growing your plants, harvesting it, and so on. And so like you're going to face really serious soil depletion, not just in the terms of like it requires a massive fertilizer load in order to grow properly, but in terms of just there being soil there in the first place, because it's all blown away, and you get desertification and stuff like that happening, right?
Yeah, absolutely. Yeah. Is there anything else for that chapter? I think we've covered all of it.
No, I think that's about it. Yeah, I think it's very disturbing. It's fascinating, but it's also disturbing.
Yeah, right. There's a lot of horror stories in this book.
Like, I mean, the stuff that Mark says about the metabolic rift, and that we covered previously, like, I feel like you really, really can see it at work here. And the thing is that, while Marx talks about the metabolic rift between humanity and nature, we can see that, with a better scientific understanding, it's more like there's sort of a vast multitude of metabolic rifts between humanity and like all kinds of non-human actors. The thing that stays constant between those two understandings is that capitalism utterly destroys the relationship and the advantage of capital. Because these plants that are engineered for these environments, they are like physical embodiments of the sort of capitalist death drive.
Thank you for listening to General Intellect Unit. While you wait for the next episode, you can find us on Twitter at GIUnitPod. You can find us on Facebook and all the podcast apps, so like, rate, and subscribe. You can also find us on the internet at generalintellectunit.net. If you go to patreon.com/generalintellectunit, you can give us a couple of bucks a month to help keep us alive and get access to a community Discord. This show is part of the Emancipation Network, a Marxist podcast network and research collective. Go to emancipation.network and check out our sister shows, such as From Alpha to Omega, Swampside Chats, and Jumpsuit Utopia. They're great shows and great folks. As always, thanks for listening. We hope you've enjoyed this show, and we hope you'll join us again next time.